Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. We're here today because we want to highlight one of the recommendations out of the Government Operations and Estimates recent report on the government's greening government strategy. That recommendation calls on the government to release the emissions reductions math, essentially, on the Energy Services Acquisition Program. That program is a project that's been under consideration by the government and that they're pushing ahead with in order to change the heating and cooling system, the central heating and cooling system that powers somewhere around 80 buildings in the National Capital Region. And their claim is that they're going to save a lot of money and they're going to reduce emissions a fair bit by transitioning from a steam system to a low temperature hot water system. The problem is that they refuse to release any of the details, either on emissions reductions targets or on the cost savings. What we've heard from staff who work at the plant, including in testimony at committee during the course of our study, is that there are serious concerns and reasons to think that, first of all, the emissions reductions anticipated by government will not be what they say they'll be. Part of that has to do with the transition from steam to low temperature hot water. Many buildings in the region use steam to control their humidity, and those buildings will have to install local boilers, which seem not to be part of the government's overall emissions estimates. Even those local boilers will have additional costs and will also have additional emissions. On the money side, the government seems to be relying on a simple dogma that somehow P3s provide better value for money, but they're not willing to prove it. And when we look at this project and the estimates by government itself that the capital project will be somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion, that's billion with a B, we think Canadians are owed a far better explanation before the project proceeds and justification of how exactly it is government thinks they're going to be lowering emissions and saving money. We've got a number of recent examples, Phoenix perhaps being the most obvious, where there are projects that public servants have raised red flags, like the red flags that are going up on this project before. Government has ignored them and pushed ahead, and the cost to Canadians financially has been substantial. And we've seen how those kinds of cost overruns multiply. So our ask is pretty simple. It's to get the information on the emissions as per an all-party recommendation of the Government Operations Committee. It's to get the business case, and that's so that this project can be evaluated before it turns into another billion-dollar boondoggle. And we think that the government owes it to Canadians to be upfront about the nature of this project and all the details of this project. So I'm really happy to be joined today by Chris Aylward, who's the National President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, and I'm going to hand the microphone over to him now to explain the PSAC's point of view on this project as well. Chris.
Great. Thank you, Daniel, and I want to take this opportunity to thank Daniel for pursuing this issue and really following up on it on behalf of federal public sector workers. This is just another prime example of this government saying one thing but doing something completely different. They say they respect and they value the work of federal public sector workers, but that is the furthest thing from the truth. And we see that today, not only in the Phoenix fiasco, but also we're still waiting for 140,000 members of the Public Service Alliance of Canada to get a fair deal at the bargaining table, as well as fair compensation for the Phoenix mess that they have been in for the last number of years. This government ignored its workers when we warned them about the Phoenix issue, and they're ignoring our demands at the bargaining table as well. Now we've asked them to press pause on this project until we can get the answers we need to make sure Canadians aren't going to lose out again, and they're not listening once again. I'm happy that the committee is joining us in urging the government to release the information we need to respect the work of public sector workers and to safeguard our communities. It shouldn't have been so hard. We had to jump through hoops to get this information. We shouldn't have had to go to a parliamentary committee to get this progress. We shouldn't have had to file complaints with the Information Commissioner on several more access to information requests. Again, I want to thank Daniel for pursuing this on behalf of federal public sector workers. Federal public sector workers deserve to be listened to. Number one, this government could learn a lesson by listening to the workers who actually know what's going on the ground, and not so much the senior bureaucrats that seem to always want to muddy the waters whenever we talk about federal projects. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Chris. So I don't know if we have some questions from anybody in the back row.
No questions.
Okay. Well, I would simply add to that in the closing days of this Parliament, one of the pieces of legislation that's been debated is C-58, which is the government's reform to the access to information laws, and the government has been quick to say that this is a wonderful new regime and that it's all about making the information Canadians need to hold the government to account more available. But I think this project is an excellent example of where there's a clear need to have more information about a project so it can be properly scrutinized before it goes ahead. We're talking again about $3 billion. That's just the projected cost. We all know that there are often cost overruns, particularly when government isn't listening to people who actually work with a given system, whether it's a payroll system or whether it's a central heating and cooling plant. When government doesn't listen to the expertise of workers who know what they're doing and know how the system works, you're more likely to get cost overruns. So even a small percentage of cost overruns on a $3 billion project is a significant cost to Canadians. We've got a government that says they want to lead the way when it comes to access to information, but their access to information reforms were panned by the Information Commissioner, the same Information Commissioner that the PSAC has had to complain to because they can't get access to the documents that they need and that Canadians need in order to be able to scrutinize this project. And I think this just, as Chris was saying, you get a Liberal government that says one thing and does another. Not only are they saying one thing in terms of their commitment to listening to public sector workers and incorporating their input into new projects and how to move forward, but we also have a government that's saying one thing when it comes to access to information. And when you look at the proof in this particular case and how they're behaving, what we have is a government that continues to try and dodge real accountability. And I'll spare you the rant on the estimates process as well, but we've seen that at committee as well, where parliamentarians themselves are continuing to get less and less information in advance of approving spending. This program is an ideal example of where the burden of proof should be on government before moving ahead, before having funds approved, before signing a contract, to show that there really is value for money, and that in this case the environmental objectives of the program are realistic and are likely to be realized. We just haven't seen that. I want to add that there are a few other problems with this project beyond cost that are, and beyond emissions. So when we talk about the environment, we're talking about a project that when moving from steam, which can be quickly evacuated from the pipe system that feeds these some 80 buildings in the National Capital Region, and moving to low temperature hot water, that's water that's treated with chemicals in order to prevent the development of mold inside those pipes. When you have to do work on those pipes, either regular routine scheduled maintenance or because of some kind of problem with the system that's emergent, you need to get the water out of the pipes in order for anybody to be able to work on those pipes. And we're talking about up to 1 million gallons of treated water being evacuated into the Ottawa River. That's a big deal. Those chemicals are carcinogenic, and the government hasn't provided any meaningful plan or idea as to how they're going to mitigate the risks of releasing that level of, or that amount of carcinogens into the Ottawa River system. And the other aspect from a building safety point of view is that if the system goes down in January, for instance, what we've heard from the technicians who work on this system and have for decades providing reliable heat and cooling to the National Capital Region is that in order to perform any of that maintenance, whereas now it takes a few hours to drain the steam out of that system, and they can be working on that system within a matter of hours, we're talking a day or more in order to drain that water out and depressurize the system, then perform whatever work they have to perform, and then another day to get the system back up and running. And anybody who's been in Ottawa in January will know that having your heating system down for 3 days is not an acceptable solution. With the steam system that we currently have, that's not on the table unless it's a really catastrophic problem that needs that much time to fix. But the additional time simply to drain and then refill the system is a serious concern in terms of building integrity. And so there are a lot of risks with this project. It's why it's been so frustrating to have such a heavily redacted business case that has none of the financial information and no real plan for what to do in the event that everything doesn't go perfectly. And we all know when we're talking about a system of this size and scope, not everything is going to go perfectly all the time. The system as it is has been quite reliable, and the people who have worked on that system and maintained that system who are telling us that there are problems with the new idea really ought to be taken seriously and included in planning for any new system. But instead, what's happening is private companies without the knowledge and expertise are being brought in as if somehow they're the experts when they're not the ones that have been doing the work for the last number of decades. And it's a backwards approach. Government ought to know better from the case of Phoenix and others, where they have ignored frontline public servants who are doing that work. And it's frustrating to me that government isn't learning the lesson. I suspect if it were their money or the money of their business, they would be far more prudent in the way they spend it. But because it's somebody else's money, they seem to think that awarding contracts to their corporate friends is the way to go, regardless of not having a plan on how to mitigate those risks. So I just want to say, unless you have a closing word, Chris, I just want to say thank you on my part for everybody, and I'll hand it over to Chris to close the news conference.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Just another example of what this government, as far as when they say that they respect and value the work of public sector workers. The previous government said that the Phoenix pay system was going to save taxpayers $70 million a year. When this government came into power, they pressed go on the Phoenix pay system. The Phoenix pay system is now costing Canadian taxpayers north of $1.5 billion, rather than $70 million a year in savings. So that's quite a lot of money. After being warned by federal public sector workers not to push the go button on Phoenix, this government completely ignored their workers, the people on the ground who actually knew what was going on with the pay system. And now, at the bargaining table, 140,000 federal public sector workers under the Public Service Alliance of Canada are in a potential strike situation because they are not coming to the bargaining table, again, respecting the work of federal public sector workers. This government, in October of 2015, the Prime Minister sent a letter to every single federal public sector worker in this country saying he respected and valued the work of federal public sector workers, but yet they are doing everything opposite to that. And they are not showing any respect at all to federal public sector workers. They're not listening to federal public sector workers when federal public sector workers are actually speaking the truth about these projects. These projects are going to cost Canadian taxpayers a lot more money being done privately than what they are being done under the public umbrella. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Cheers.